You hear stories working at a zoo. Some are heartwarming, some are heartbreaking, but every once in a while, a story emerges that makes everyone stop, lean in, and listen. This is one of those stories. I've been volunteering at the zoo for over 15 years. I've seen births, medical emergencies, incredible animal friendships, and the rare kind of cleverness that makes you question just how different we are from the creatures we care for. But nothing, and I mean nothing, left as lasting an impression on me as Rambo, the Sumatran orangutan with the mind of a locksmith and the spirit of a magician. Rambo wasn't named for action movies, though you'd be forgiven for assuming that. He was called Rambo because of his broad shoulders and the way he carried himself. Even as a young male, he had that slow, deliberate swagger. But unlike the fictional namesake, Rambo wasn't known for brute strength. No, it was his intelligence that set him apart. The keepers all whispered about him. Not in fear, but in deep respect. You didn't take your eye off Rambo for long. You couldn't afford to. The first time I saw Rambo, I was on my second week volunteering in the primate section. It was a warm, humid morning in June, and I was helping prepare enrichment items, simple puzzles stuffed with fruit, hidden treats in boxes, and ropes that led to nowhere, just to give the apes something to think about. We were told to watch closely how the orangutans interacted with these toys. Every movement tells you something, said Greg, one of the senior keepers. While most of the orangutans batted or shook their enrichment items, Rambo didn't. He examined them. I'll never forget that. He'd turn something over with his fingers, sniff it, squint at it, and sometimes even poke it with a twig. He once spent 10 straight minutes slowly peeling away layers of a wrapped box to get to a banana, while the others had long since lost interest and wandered off. Rambo had no interest in rushing. He wasn't greedy, he was curious. Methodical. Greg used to say, "You give Rambo time, and he'll give you trouble." At the time, I didn't quite understand what that meant. That changed a few months later. Rambo lived in one of the older enclosures, a spacious indoor-outdoor setup with climbing structures, hanging tires, and a shallow moat that circled the habitat. It was secured with heavy-gauge fencing and reinforced gates. The locks were industrial-grade, the kind you'd find on a secure warehouse door. Double-latched, bolted, and fitted with padlocks. There were cameras too, watching every angle. But none of that mattered to Rambo. No one saw the moment he got out. That's the truth of it. One morning, just after opening, the zoo's radio network exploded with chatter. Code Green, Section 12. All staff respond. Containment issue. I was in the education center nearby when the call came in, and I saw the flurry of uniforms rush past. I didn't know then who had gotten out. I assumed it was a lemur or maybe a capuchin. They were known for being escape artists. But when I reached the scene, the energy in the air was different. Tense. Focused. Several keepers were moving quickly but carefully, talking in clipped phrases. And then I heard someone say it. "It's Rambo. He's out." No one panicked. Not openly. But there was an undercurrent of disbelief. Rambo's enclosure was built like a bank vault. Escapes just didn't happen, not from there. They eventually found him 20 minutes later, 2 sections down, sitting calmly near the visitor viewing area, outside his enclosure, but not outside the zoo. He wasn't running, wasn't hiding. He was just sitting under a tree, watching the early visitors filter in with their kids, as if he were on a Sunday stroll. Getting him back in wasn't hard. A familiar keeper called to him, offered a favorite treat, dried mango, I think, and Rambo simply walked back, no fuss. It was like he'd taken a short walk and was ready to go home. The zoo went into full review mode. Security footage was pulled, gates were inspected, logs checked, and that's when the staff discovered something truly astonishing. There was no breach, no lock had failed, no door was broken. Rambo had opened the gate himself. The footage, grainy in parts but clear enough, showed Rambo climbing down from a platform after the keepers had finished evening checks the night before. He'd watched, and he remembered. With delicate, practiced precision, he pulled a piece of stiff wire from the enrichment bin, something that had snapped off a toy days earlier and had gone unnoticed. Then, as the lights dimmed and the zoo closed, he went to work. It took him almost half an hour. He used the wire like a makeshift pick, inserting it into the padlock mechanism and working it slowly. You could see his hands moving with eerie calm, testing tension, adjusting angles. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He knew what he was doing. Eventually, the shackle popped. He slid the lock off, unbolted the latch, and pushed open the gate. No one had trained him to do this. No human had ever shown him how to manipulate a lock. And yet, he did it. The realization that an orangutan had cracked a lock designed to be tamper-proof by human standards sent ripples through the staff. Meetings were held. The incident was classified internally as non-threatening but significant. More locks were added. Cameras were repositioned. And Rambo, well, he was watched even more closely. But here's the part that I'll never forget. After everything, after the review and the panic and the minor headlines that followed, I asked Greg, the senior keeper, what he thought Rambo was doing out there. He didn't hesitate. He wasn't escaping, Greg said. He was exploring. He wanted to know what was beyond the gate. Not to leave us, just to understand. Rambo doesn't break out, he investigates. And I believe that. Rambo was tested several times after that incident. Not officially, of course, but the staff kept giving him more complicated enrichment puzzles. Locks with latches, twist mechanisms, even childproof containers. And time after time, Rambo solved them. He didn't brag. He didn't do it for attention. He'd quietly dismantle the puzzles, examine the contents, then move on. As if saying, okay, I understand now. We've always known orangutans were intelligent. But Rambo wasn't just smart. He was aware. There's a difference. He watched us. He learned from us. And then, when we weren't looking, he used what he'd learned. This is just the beginning of Rambo's story. Because what happened next proved that his first escape wasn't a fluke. It was just a warm-up. After the first escape, you'd think the zoo would have done everything in its power to make sure it never happened again. And it did, on paper. Extra locks, new procedures, increased camera coverage, and a policy requiring two-person checks on all primate enclosures. But if you've worked around orangutans long enough, you know something the rest of the world is still catching up to: they remember. And Rambo remembered everything. About a month after the incident, things seemed to settle down. Rambo had gone back to his usual routine, climbing, foraging, solving puzzles faster than we could make them. He even started working on knots. Thick, tangled ropes that most orangutans would just tug at. Rambo would sit with them for 20-30 minutes, loosening them loop by loop like an old sailor entangling a net. At one point, one of the newer keepers joked, "We should test him with a combination lock," and I'll never forget Greg's response. "Only if you want him teaching us how it works." There's a certain quietness to real intelligence. Rambo didn't show off. That wasn't his way. But every now and then, you'd see him watching the keepers during lockup. Not always directly, sometimes in reflections, sometimes from behind a post, but he was watching. Processing. Cataloging. It was during this period that something started to change in how the keepers viewed Rambo. Not with fear, never that, but with a kind of humbled awareness. The same way you look at a coworker who's better at something than you, and you know they are. They started talking about him less like a primate and more like a colleague. "Let's not underestimate the big guy," Greg would say during morning briefings. "Assume he knows more than we think." Then came the second incident. It was a cold morning in late October, a Tuesday. The zoo was quiet, schools hadn't started field trips yet, and the sky was overcast. I was helping with an educational program across from the primate building when I heard the first radio call. It wasn't a code green like before. Just a request. "Can someone confirm Rambo's enclosure check for this morning?" That alone was enough to set off a chain reaction. Within minutes, 2 keepers and a supervisor were jogging, not running, because protocol doesn't allow panic, to the primate section. I followed at a distance, heart in my throat. By the time I arrived, they'd already locked the building down. But here's the thing, Rambo wasn't missing. He was inside, in his enclosure, sitting calmly, eating. Only, the lock on the secondary holding gate, the one used during cleaning shifts, was open. The gate itself was closed, but the bolt had been undone. No staff had reported entering or opening it that morning. The first assumption was human error. Maybe someone forgot to re-latch it. Maybe a lock was left half-turned. But then the footage told another story. Rambo had waited again. Not overnight this time, but during early morning hours, right after shift change. The cameras caught him retrieving another thin object, possibly a fragment of zip tie from earlier enrichment, and working at the gate. But this time, he closed it again. That was the part no one expected. He opened the lock, slid it out, stepped into the shift tunnel, looked around, and then, after a minute, turned back, reclosed the gate, and latched it. Poorly, but intentionally. That rattled the keepers more than the first escape. Not because of danger. Rambo had never once acted aggressively, but because of what it meant. He knows it matters, Greg said quietly that afternoon, looking at the footage again. He understands that leaving it open changes something. That we notice. That it causes a reaction. I asked him what he thought Rambo had been doing in the tunnel. Testing us, he said. The official record listed the incident as compromised lock integrity, no breach. But everyone on staff knew, Rambo was working out the puzzle again. Not just the physical locks, but the people. The patterns. He was mapping not just the enclosure, but the entire routine. From then on, everything with Rambo became more deliberate. Enrichment had to be rotated weekly so he didn't learn the patterns. Doors and latches were double-checked, triple-checked. Cleaning crews were warned not to carry any items that could be repurposed into tools. And still, he found ways to keep us on edge. There was the time he disassembled the bolts on a feeder panel. No tools, just fingers, patience, and maybe a piece of rock. Another time, he used a discarded food tray to reach a hanging latch that no one thought he could access. Always quiet, always methodical, always testing. Visitors, of course, had no idea. To them, Rambo was a calm, majestic orangutan lounging under the shade, chewing on a branch, maybe tossing a cloth over his head when it rained. But those of us behind the scenes began to realize we were dealing with something more. Not a pet, not a trained animal, a thinker, a planner. That realization changed the way we worked. Some keepers even started journaling their interactions with Rambo, like you would with a complex patient. Observations, guesses, reflections. He's anticipating things, one note read. Reacted before I even touched the latch today. Could he hear the pattern of my keys? By early winter, something remarkable had happened. Rambo had changed the entire operational culture of the primate house. Because of him, new training was introduced for volunteers. Keepers were encouraged to vary their routines. Simple actions, how someone walked, how long they stood near a gate, were reviewed for patterns. Not because Rambo was dangerous, but because he was observing. And all the while, he never once acted out. Never once tried to hurt anyone. That's what made it so profound. He wasn't trying to escape in the usual sense. He was experimenting, and each time he succeeded in learning something new, he didn't use it recklessly. He simply filed it away. But Rambo's most famous moment, the one that would eventually land him a feature on local news, and even a short piece in a primatology journal, hadn't happened yet. That came next. His third and final escape attempt wasn't just clever. It was surgical. There's a kind of quiet dread that settles over a zoo staff when an animal outsmarts the system, not because of danger, but because it means something isn't working the way we thought it was. When a bird finds a way through a net, or a monkey learns to trick sensors with a reflection, you plug the hole. But when it's Rambo, when it's a 150-pound primate with dexterous hands, a steel trap memory, and the patience of a chess master, you start to wonder if you can ever be one step ahead. The final incident, Rambo's third, didn't begin with a failed lock or a broken latch. It began with a shadow. It was a Thursday in early March. A few of us had stayed late helping set up for a weekend conservation fundraiser. I was walking past the orangutan building around 6:45 p.m., well past closing. The public was gone. Most of the staff had clocked out. But as I passed the back of the building, I noticed something strange, the silhouette of a large figure near the service corridor window. Now, I've worked with enough apes to know the difference between a keeper in a jacket and an orangutan. The figure wasn't wearing clothes. It was too broad, too low to the ground. It was Rambo. I froze. My first thought, someone forgot to lock him in. But then I looked again. He wasn't loose in the zoo, not yet. He was in the secondary corridor, a zone between the main enclosure and the service access, rarely used except during major cleanings or maintenance. The outer corridor door was closed. But I didn't know for how long. I radioed Greg. I think Rambo's in the transition corridor. There was silence on the line. Then, calm but sharp. Do not approach. Stay in sightline. I'm on my way. Within 5 minutes, we had a small team assembled. Cameras confirmed it. Rambo had, once again, unlocked a gate. But this time, he'd done something that shook everyone. He'd disabled the camera, not ripped it out or smashed it. Just turned it, gently, just enough so it faced the wall. He knew. Somehow, he knew. The footage before it turned showed Rambo climbing up a support beam with a strip of fabric, one of the enclosure blankets, long and narrow, twisted like a rope. He looped it around the camera housing and nudged it until it swiveled. Not violently, just enough. Then he went to work on the lock. The corridor door was supposed to be inaccessible to the animals. It was fitted with a recessed mechanism, shielded by a metal plate. But someone, no one ever confessed, had left a cleaning tool behind a week earlier. A small hooked scraper with a rubber grip. It was meant for scouring algae off glass, but in the right hands, or the right feet, it could be something more. Rambo used it as an extension. He reached through the lower gate gap and slowly worked the latch from the inside. It took him 20 minutes. He had to reposition 3 times. He made a loop in the cloth, secured the tool, and rotated the lock pin. One of the newer staff members who reviewed the footage said, "This is mechanical reasoning." Like, advanced mechanical reasoning. Once inside the corridor, Rambo didn't bolt. He didn't even move for several minutes. He just sat, listening, watching, waiting. And here's where it gets really interesting. When Greg and the senior team arrived, they didn't sound alarms. No code green, no sirens, just a quiet plan. Greg approached the secondary viewing glass, where Rambo could see him, and held up a set of keys. He didn't rattle them. He didn't beckon. He just stood there. Rambo watched him. Then Greg placed the keys on the floor in front of the window, stepped back, and crouched down, eye level, hands on his knees, a non-threatening pose. I swear to you, what happened next is seared into my memory forever. Rambo stood, moved to the inner gate, sat, and waited. Greg nodded to one of the keepers. They opened the outer access door, slowly. Rambo didn't move. He let them open the shift tunnel gate. Still didn't move. Then, without prompting, Rambo turned, walked into the tunnel, entered the enclosure, and sat on the platform. He gave himself up. The lock was resecured. The building cleared. And only then, did the weight of what had happened settle in. Rambo had orchestrated the entire thing. Not for escape, not to flee, but to test the limits of what he could understand. And then, when he was done, he went back. He was never trying to leave, Greg said later that night, leaning on a railing with a paper cup of coffee. He just wanted to know if he could. The fallout was less dramatic than you'd think. There was no media frenzy. The zoo issued a quiet internal review. Lock systems were upgraded, again. The cleaning tool policy was overhauled. More cameras, more staff briefings. But the biggest change was in how we approached Rambo's mind. He wasn't just another orangutan. He was a problem solver, a planner, and more than anything, a mirror. Watching us as we watched him, learning our habits, interpreting our movements, anticipating our decisions. He became a case study in primate intelligence, an example presented at conferences, discussed in staff training, even referenced in a white paper by a visiting primatologist. Spontaneous tool use and lock mechanism manipulation in a captive Sumatran orangutan. Dry title. Incredible subject. As for Rambo himself, he mellowed. Or maybe, having answered the questions he'd been asking in his own quiet way, he just turned to new challenges. The team began offering him increasingly complex puzzles, locking boxes within boxes, sequencing tasks, logic boards. He tackled them with the same serene precision. Visitors still saw him as the quiet giant in the enclosure. Most never knew the full story. But every keeper, every volunteer, every night security officer who walked past that building knew exactly who Rambo was. He wasn't trying to get out. He was trying to understand the world that kept him in. And if that doesn't make you rethink what we mean by animal intelligence, nothing will.